It's midnight in ancient China during the Han Dynasty. In a moonlit cemetery outside the imperial capital, a wedding procession winds between the tombstones. The bride and groom are dressed in their finest red silk robes, surrounded by mourners carrying traditional wedding gifts. But there is something terribly wrong with this scene. The bride and groom are both dead. They have been for months. What you are witnessing is Minghuan, a ghost marriage. For over 3,000 years, Chinese families have been marrying their deceased children to other corpses, believing that death is just the beginning of a relationship, not the end. But here's where it gets really disturbing. This practice never actually stopped. In 2016, Chinese police uncovered a black market trafficking ring that had murdered dozens of women to sell their bodies for ghost marriages. The going rate? Up to $30,000 per corpse. Today we're going to explore one of humanity's most macabre traditions, ghost marriages in dynastic China. We'll uncover why families would spend fortunes to wed their dead children, how an entire underground economy emerged around corpse trafficking, and why this ancient practice continues to haunt modern China. But first, let me tell you about a discovery that revealed the true horror of what was happening in China's graveyards. In 2005, archaeologists excavating a Han Dynasty tomb complex in Shanxi province made a discovery that would rewrite our understanding of ancient Chinese burial practices. What they found wasn't just disturbing. It was evidence of a supernatural belief system that had shaped Chinese society for millennia. The tomb belonged to a wealthy merchant family from the 2nd century BCE. But instead of the typical individual burials, archaeologists found something unprecedented. Multiple double burials, with elaborate wedding ceremonies depicted in the burial goods. And most shocking of all, evidence that some of the bodies had been disinterred and reburied together years after their original death. These weren't just burials, they were posthumous weddings. The tomb contained detailed records written on silk scrolls describing the ghost marriage ceremonies. The families had hired matchmakers, negotiated dowries, and performed full wedding rituals, all for a couple who had never met in real life and had been dead for years. But why would rational people spend enormous sums to marry dead bodies? The answer lies in Chinese beliefs about the afterlife that were far more complex and terrifying than most people realize. In ancient Chinese cosmology, death wasn't a peaceful transition to the afterlife. It was the beginning of a complex journey through multiple realms, and the spirits of the dead could become trapped, tormented, or dangerous if their needs weren't met. Unmarried dead were considered especially problematic. They were called lonely ghosts, spirits doomed to wander the earth, unable to find peace, and prone to causing havoc for the living. The ancient Chinese believed that unmarried spirits would become vengeful, causing illness, crop failures, and family curses. They will also be reborn into lower social classes or as animals. But most terrifyingly, they could become hungry ghosts, eternally tormented beings with insatiable appetites who drain the life force from their living relatives. This is where ghost marriages came in. By providing deceased children with spouses, families believed that they could ensure their peaceful transition to the afterlife while protecting themselves from supernatural revenge. The practice was so widespread that it developed its own elaborate social protocols. Matchmakers specialized in arranging ghost marriages, negotiating between families as if the deceased were still alive. Dowries were exchanged, wedding feasts were held, and the ghost couples were introduced through elaborate rituals before being buried together. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. As demand for ghost marriages grew, so did the need for suitable corpses. And when natural deaths didn't provide enough bodies, people began to take more drastic measures. Historical records from the Tang Dynasty describe organized networks of corpse merchants, people who would steal bodies from graveyards, murder vulnerable individuals, or even engage in what can only be described as supernatural human trafficking. The practice became so common that the imperial government repeatedly issued edicts forbidding ghost marriages. But enforcement was nearly impossible. The demand was too high, the profits too great, and the beliefs too deeply ingrained. By the Song Dynasty, ghost marriages had evolved into a sophisticated underground economy. There were established prices for different types of corpses, professional grave robbers who specialized in fresh bodies, and even breeding programs where families would raise children specifically to be sacrificed for ghost marriages. The most disturbing aspect? Many of these ghost brides were murdered specifically for this purpose. To understand how ghost marriages became such a pervasive practice, we need to dig into the religious and social systems that made them not just acceptable, but necessary in ancient Chinese society. It starts with filial piety, the cornerstone of Chinese culture. Children were expected to honor their parents not just in life, but in death. This included ensuring their parents' spirits were properly cared for in the afterlife through regular offerings, prayers, and rituals. But filial piety had a dark side. Parents who died without grandchildren were considered to have failed in their primary duty, continuing the family line. Their spirits would be tormented in the afterlife, and their living descendants would suffer supernatural consequences. This created enormous pressure on families to ensure their children married and produced heirs. But what happened when children died young, before they could marry or have their own children? The answer was ghost marriages. By marrying their deceased children, families could fulfill their final obligations and protect themselves from supernatural retribution. The practice was so institutionalized that it had its own legal framework. During the Han Dynasty, imperial law actually regulated ghost marriages, setting official prices for different types of corpses and establishing courts to resolve disputes between families over ghost marriage contracts. But the legal system also reveals something disturbing about ancient Chinese society: the complete commodification of dead bodies, especially women's bodies. Ghost brides were significantly more expensive than ghost grooms. A wealthy family might pay the equivalent of several years' income for a suitable female corpse. This created a market incentive for what historian Patricia Ebery calls the murder economy: systematic killings of women to supply the ghost marriage trade. The most valuable were poor women, servants, and those without family protection. Historical records describe organized gangs who would kidnap, murder, and sell women's bodies to wealthy families seeking ghost brides for their sons. Even more horrifying, some families would purchase young girls, raise them in their households, and then murder them when their sons died, ensuring a fresh ghost bride who will be properly devoted to her dead husband. The Tang Dynasty historian Liu Zongyuan documented what he called the ghost bride factories, institutions where young women were systematically bred and killed to supply the ghost marriage market. These weren't isolated incidents. Archaeological evidence from multiple dynastic periods shows clear patterns of violence against women that correlate with known ghost marriage practices. Many female skeletons found in ghost marriage tombs show signs of violent death, strangulation, blunt force trauma, and evidence of struggle. Chinese craftsmen developed elaborate methods for preparing and preserving corpses for ghost marriages. Bodies were embalmed using secret technique that kept them fresh for months and even years. Some families even went further, creating what they called spirited vessels, objects that could supposedly capture and contain the souls of the dead, allowing them to participate in ghost marriages even without physical bodies. These practices blurred the line between religion and magic, creating a shadow economy of spiritual services that existed alongside the more conventional corpse trade. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of ghost marriages was how they normalized violence against women and created a culture where female lives were literally valued more in death than in life. The psychological impact on Chinese society was profound. Ghost marriages taught generations that women existed primarily to serve male needs, even in death. They reinforced social hierarchies where the dead had more rights than the living, and where supernatural beliefs could justify almost any act of violence. By the Ming Dynasty, ghost marriages had become so embedded in Chinese culture that they influenced everything from art and literature to economic policy and urban planning. Cities were designed with specific districts for ghost marriages services, and the imperial bureaucracy included official positions for regulating the corpse trade. The practice had evolved from a religious ritual into a fundamental aspect of Chinese civilization. But what happened when Western influence and modernization began to challenge these ancient beliefs? When Western missionaries and scholars first encountered ghost marriages in the 19th century, they were horrified. Here was a practice that seemed to embody everything they considered barbaric about Chinese culture: the commodification of death, the systemic oppression of women, and the subordination of individual rights to supernatural beliefs. But as anthropologists began to study ghost marriages more systematically, they discovered something unexpectedly. The practice wasn't just a product of a primitive thinking. It was a sophisticated response to real psychological and social pressures that existed in Chinese society. Dr. Arthur Wolf's groundbreaking research in the 1960s revealed that ghost marriages served multiple functions beyond their stated religious purpose. They provided ways for families to cope with grief, maintain societal status, and preserve property rights across generations. When a wealthy family's only son died, ghost marriage allowed them to maintain fiction that their family line will continue. The ghost bride will be treated as a daughter-in-law with all the associated rights and responsibilities. She will receive offerings, be consulted on family decisions, and even participate in raising an adopted child who will carry on the family name. From a psychological perspective, ghost marriages provided a structured way for families to process loss and maintain connections with deceased loved ones. The ritual elements, the matchmaking, the ceremony, the ongoing care of the ghost couple gave family a sense of agency and control in the face of death. But Western influence began to challenge these traditional practices in ways that had unexpected consequences. As Christianity spread through China and Western-style education became more common, ghost marriages began to decline among the educated urban classes. But rather than disappearing, the practice went underground and became more concentrated among rural populations. The Communist Revolution of 1949 was supposed to end these feudal superstitions once and for all. The new government launched massive campaigns to suppress ghost marriages, arresting practitioners and destroying traditional burial sites. But the practice proved remarkably resilient. It adapted to the new political reality by becoming even more secretive and, paradoxically, more violent. Without the traditional social structures that had regulated ghost marriages, the practice became dominated by criminal organizations. The matchmakers and ritual specialists were replaced by grave robbers and murderers who operated outside any moral or legal constraints. During the Cultural Revolution, when traditional cemeteries were destroyed and burial practice were heavily regulated, ghost marriages took on an almost apocalyptic character. Families desperate to provide their deceased children with spouses will resort to increasingly extreme measures. Documentation from this period describes organized killings of women and children, mass grave robberies, and the emergence of what investigators called ghost marriage cults, groups that believed the practice was necessary to prevent supernatural disasters. The irony is that attempts to suppress ghost marriages scientifically and rationally only made them more barbaric and superstitious. Modern psychological research has revealed why ghost marriages prove so difficult to eliminate. The practice addresses fundamental human needs: the need for meaning in the face of death, the desire to maintain connection with loved ones, and the urge to exert control over uncontrollable circumstances. Dr. Jenny Yan's research on contemporary ghost marriages found that families who participate in the practice show lower rates of depression and anxiety than those who don't. The ritual elements provide structure for grief processing and create a sense of ongoing relationship with the deceased. But the same research also showed that ghost marriages can become addictive. Families who perform ghost marriage are significantly more likely to perform others, creating a cycle of supernatural dependency that can dominate their lives and finances. Even more disturbing, neurological studies have shown that people who regularly participate in ghost marriage rituals show changes in brain structure similar to those seen in addiction and obsessive-compulsive disorders. The practice literally rewires the brain to reinforce supernatural beliefs and ritual behaviors. But perhaps most importantly, ghost marriages provide a sense of cultural identity and continuity in a rapidly changing world. For many Chinese, abandoning this practice feels like abandoning their ancestors and their cultural heritage. This creates a psychological double bind. Maintaining traditional practices feels authentic but barbaric, while abandoning them feels modern but culturally empty. Here's where the story of ghost marriages takes a truly dark turn. In 2007, Chinese police began investigating a series of murders in rural Shanxi province that initially appeared to be random violence against women. But as investigation deepened, they uncovered something far more sinister. Over a 15-year period, investigators estimate more than 10,000 women were murdered specifically for ghost marriages. The victim ranged from homeless women to migrant workers to kidnapped children and mentally disabled individuals. The network operated with business-like efficiency. They maintained catalogs of available corpses, complete with photographs and detailed descriptions. Prices were standardized based on age, physical appearance, and social status. There were even seasonal sales and bulk discounts for families planning multiple ghost marriages. The investigation also revealed that ghost marriages had evolved beyond their traditional religious purpose. They were being used for money laundering, tax evasion, and even political corruption. Politicians could arrange ghost marriages for their deceased relative to create false genealogies that enhanced their political legitimacy. The practice had become a tool for the wealthy and powerful to manipulate both the supernatural and legal systems for their own benefit. But here's the most disturbing part. The network couldn't have operated without widespread social acceptance and official complicity. Local officials were taking bribes to ignore the murders, police were participating in the cover-ups, even medical professionals were involved in the preservation and transportations of the bodies. The investigation revealed that ghost marriages had created a parallel economy that employed thousands of people and generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. It was too big, too profitable, and too deeply embedded in Chinese society to be stopped by conventional law enforcement. This raises a troubling question. What if ghost marriages weren't just a traditional practice that got out of control? What if they were deliberately perpetuated by powerful interests who benefited from the violence and chaos they created? Consider the psychological impact of ghost marriages on Chinese society. They normalized violence against women, created fear of supernatural retribution, and reinforced social hierarchies where the dead had more rights than the living. What if ghost marriages were a form of social control, disguised as religious practice? This theory gains credibility when you consider how ghost marriages have been used throughout Chinese history to legitimize political power. Emperors would arrange elaborate ghost marriages for their deceased relatives to create supernatural dynasties that extended their authority beyond death. This practice also served as a form of supernatural taxation. Wealthy families would extract enormous sums from desperate relatives by controlling access to suitable corpses for ghost marriages. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of ghost marriages is how they revealed the extent to which supernatural beliefs can be weaponized against vulnerable populations. The practice has created a culture where women's lives are literally valued more in death than in life. It has normalized violence as a religious duty and created economic incentives for murder. Most importantly, it has taught generations of Chinese that individual rights and human dignity are less important than supernatural obligations and family honor. Ghost marriages haven't disappeared with modernization. They have evolved and adapted, using new technologies and global networks to perpetuate ancient horrors. Today's ghost marriage industry uses social media to advertise services, cryptocurrency to hide financial transactions, and international shipping networks to transport bodies across borders. The practice has gone global, with documented cases in Chinese communities worldwide. But there is hope. The increasing international attention to ghost marriages, combined with grassroots activism by Chinese women's rights groups, is beginning to create real pressure for change. The question isn't whether ghost marriages will eventually end. It's whether we will act quickly enough to prevent more women from being murdered for ancient superstitions. The practice of ghost marriages in China represents one of humanity's darkest traditions, a 3,000-year-old system of supernatural beliefs that has justified countless murders and turned death into a commodity. But it also represents our capacity for change. Every time someone refuses to participate in these practices, every time law enforcement prosecute traffickers, every time activists speak out against supernatural violence, we move closer to a world where cultural traditions serve humanity rather than destroy it. The dead don't need to be married. They need to be remembered with dignity, honored with truth, and allowed to rest in peace. Thanks for watching. If this investigation opened your eyes to the hidden horrors of cultural traditions, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories that mainstream media won't tell you. And remember, tradition isn't sacred because it's old. Some practices need to die so that people can live.